Luke, thank you again for being willing to speak with us, especially so soon after we just released your podcast appearance. It's currently the week of November 10th, and we just released one of our best episodes yet with you sharing secrets of VC talent partner work. Well, one of the most interesting things that I've seen come out of the VC talent partner community is the Lightspeed annual survey. And as we were wrapping up talking to you in the podcast, you said it's about to be released. And so we immediately asked you if you'd be willing to share some of the insights, and just really appreciate you being willing to dig into it a little bit, give a little bit more context than people might be able to get, just through following the link. And thanks so much for being back with us so soon.
Yeah, of course. Can't get enough for you too. So thanks for having me.
Well, hey, we have the People Trends Report of 2025. Maybe we could start, Luke, by you giving a little bit of the history of what is this People Trends Report? How long's it been around? What's the focus area been? Give us the background for those folks that aren't as familiar with it.
Sure. And then for folks that are new here, I'm Luke. I'm a partner at Lightspeed, where I run a bunch of different random things, where I work with our early stage portfolio. And then we also build a lot of the knowledge pieces. I think this is our fourth year doing the People Trends Report. And then we also have one that'll come out in early next year that's focused on sales benchmarking. Those might seem random if you watch the last discussion we had around what I do as a talent role or a VC platform role. And that kind of goes into that whole point of you kind of do whatever you want that you think is interesting and useful. And so we started doing these reports originally. It's myself, Kat Flanagan, that's on my team, Jackie Williams, that's on the marketing team, and then help from a lot of other folks. Mostly because there were a lot of questions we were getting we couldn't answer, and there's not very good survey data for venture-backed startups. Most of the data that's out there are more industry reports of very large companies and not in our weird subset of the world. So we started running these. We always ask some core questions around, the really tactical stuff everybody wants to know. What is attrition this year? What's the drivers of it? What are merit increase budgets? We have different comp questions in there. And then we just rotate topics. So over the years, we've done things like the shift to remote work and how people were dealing with kind of the return to work around COVID, things around team structure and design. And then, of course, the obvious one this year was, how is AI impacting organizational structure, people teams, productivity at work? And again, most of what I've seen has been either anecdotal or from very large companies like Deloitte and McKinsey kind of making broad industry predictions. So we ran this with 167 companies. It's not just Lightspeed's. There are also teams that are just in our network. So the only criteria is be venture backed. Kind of pulled out 6 or so key findings that we thought are useful to people leaders, finance leaders, ops leaders, founder folk as they are thinking about planning for next year and kind of beyond.
Awesome. I think we're so eager just to dive into some of these findings. Maybe we just begin with what was one of the big trends that you saw? You mentioned there's 6. We can tick our way through them.
So worth knowing for the folks that are watching this, is this relevant to me? So we had a pretty healthy mix of stage of company, capital raised, number of employees. There's different ways to essentially figure out who you are. When I was looking through this, one of the ways that we looked at the data was largely around number of employees, and some of those other things are relatively arbitrary. So, the size and complexity of teams is how we did a lot of the analysis.
This is great. And then for those who can't see the screen, I think a good chunk of the geographic participants are not surprisingly from the Bay Area, next largest from New York, and then remote companies as the bulk of it. And then from industry, sizably from SaaS, and then a good smattering across all the other industries after that.
Luke, I don't see AI called out as a separate subsegment industry.
The reason we don't do that, it's a great question, is since everything is AI-ified now, then it just gives us a glob of companies that we can't actually tell what market are you in, who do you sell to, or who are you building or selling to. When we do surveys, and we particularly do this in the go-to-market survey, we ask, are you AI native? And even that's a little messy, but we're trying to figure out, is AI core to the product, or everybody has an AI product now? It's just a messy world. And if you see an investment deck these days, everybody is AI native, even if they never have been before.
Makes sense.
So this is a slide for folks that can see that just kind of highlights 6 of those key areas that we found. And I'll just start talking about them and jump in and ask me a few questions as you want.
Great.
So one of those top things we wanted to know is people are getting more productive, but how much more productive? So as we looked at companies in aggregate, it was actually relatively similar across technical and non-technical roles. I was a little surprised by that, since the tooling built for engineering is just better. But then again, as I built this report with the team, we use Claude a lot. So I think it's just more measurable potentially for engineering teams.
And Luke, before you go much further, this is a self-reported metric, right? We're not counting widgets or lines of code. You're asking people what
Correct.
percentage.
And we were vague about productivity on purpose because there is still a very broad debate over like, is lines of code committed now actually a good measure for engineering productivity? Maybe not, because you could just put a bunch of AI slop in. So that is a very good call out, as productivity is slightly subjective to the eye of the beholder. The average number we saw was about a 27% productivity gain for, particularly technical teams. We wanted to look a little bit deeper, and some of the themes that came out are directionally correct and useful. One of those was that smaller companies that obviously are starting out are AI native, it's faster and easier to adopt some of these tools. They see a larger productivity boost. So that average is about 33%. But actually, other than company size, the number one correlation between getting maximum productivity gain from tooling is actually hiring for that as a required proficiency and competency. When we ask like how folks enforce this, so only 15% of startups actually mandate AI proficiency as part of their technical hires, meaning that they test for it. And those companies that do saw a 38% productivity gain, which is 11 points higher than that average. Takeaway for people leaders here and talent leaders is understanding these tools and using them effectively now is a very predictive way to know how much they'll be able to use them in your company. And the only way you can really test for that is if you make it an interview criteria and then actually interview for it.
Well, one of the other things that jumps out in looking at some of these stats, 27% productivity increase, 33%. 38%. These are big numbers. We have not been working with AI for all that long. I don't know if it's surprising to me, but it just stands out that it is so big. Do you have any opinion on the magnitude of these productivity increase reports?
Yeah, it's big. And a lot of these fundings are kind of intertwined. So it's big, and it's, to your point, it's early days, in our sales survey, in this survey, and, when we look at this across different metrics, like there is still a large gap between what tools promise and then what they deliver. So even with lots of tools not fully living up to the expectations and the outcomes of the teams that they hired, and so that last insight there, that 2/3 of HR tools are under delivering on promises, and that is measured by, did the AI tools you're using meet your ROI expectations, exceed them, or below that? Most teams struggle because they have disparate systems, they don't talk to each other, the data's unstructured, they've got a lot of productivity from transactional workflows like candidate sourcing. In that case, would be customer outreach, some of these AI-based message customization, interview scheduling, like operational things that do make you more effective. But where it's not really impacting anything is headcount forecasting, having like useful performance management decisions that are tied into the broader operating framework of the company. None of that analytics and data is still very, very new. So yes, it's a large number, but we're seeing this across all industries. There's this move towards having more kind of forward deployed engineering motion where you have a tool, particularly if it's a complex tool that needs to integrate with a lot of folks or a lot of different areas, having a forward deployed engineer, and this you can imagine putting in like a Workday HRIS system, that being more effective about how you integrate this in workflows so that you actually close the gap on, hey, we say we do all this stuff, but we do 90% of it and you actually need it to do 100% of it. Like that's all coming in the future. So this number is just going to go up.
Yeah, and I don't know if this level of detail was asked for in the survey, so this might just be anecdotal based off of what you've been seeing in your own work, where the tools are most useful. You had mentioned, like, even for my team, using Claude was probably the biggest lift from a productivity boost to using AI tools. What's your sense of what are the tools, whether technical, non-technical split, or just generally, that you are hearing have led to most of these productivity gains?
So definitely on the technical side, it's Claude, it's the coding automation tools, and this is now starting to affect other parts of the product design lifecycle. So on the people side, the percentages look a little weird, the percentage of people that picked that as one of the categories. So you can see recruiting and talent acquisition is by far the top. And that's what we'd expect with candidate identification, outreach, scheduling, and those pieces. And then very far on the bottom, as I mentioned, you're going to see workforce planning, real compensation and benefits planning, and any onboarding and training and actually like knowledge sharing. And then up on the right, you'll see data privacy is always a huge issue. And then integrating with systems. That's actually the same thing we found last year when we asked. The percentage of folks that said their implementations met or exceeded is really just about static. And the reasons it's not higher is also the same. In some areas, this can be slow progress, but it will happen eventually.
It's incredible to be able to see percentages against which areas are leveraging AI, because I think we all are anecdotally hearing it's being used a lot in recruiting and talent acquisition. But to see this is almost 80% of the AI implementation is happening in this area, it's just really useful to know, wow, like if we aren't using this at our company for recruiting and talent acquisition, we have kind of missed the boat right now and we should get on as soon as possible. Whereas some of the other things, like we're not using it for workforce planning, forecasting, okay, that's at 8% on the other side of the spectrum. Okay, maybe we can wait another 6 months or a year and see what tooling is coming out that might be better for it.
As we talk about productivity gains, so we try to then look into, well, what is driving these from a behavior perspective? Still actually relatively rare for companies to measure employees in their performance reviews and reward them around usage of AI tooling. And so most folks don't consider it. And then a smaller subset of companies actually provide formal AI training, about 24% of those tended to be companies over 500 people. And it was actually kind of negatively correlated with how productive they are. I think the takeaway there is folks are implementing training around AI tooling to try and upskill or retool their workforce, which by nature, if you're doing that, means that you're already starting from behind. So it's more remediation than it is, hey, you're a B+ in being able to use Claude Code. We want to make you an A+. It's around kind of the fundamentals of how you can use some of these tools. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just might take more time to do, and it's not going to be an overnight fix, particularly if the behaviors and then the workforce are just not used to using this stuff and embedding it in their workflows. So I was kind of surprised that I thought training would somehow lead to better outcomes, but at least not in the time frame that we surveyed.
It's interesting to me, the bottom right of this slide, talks about performance reviews, that there's this missing link. If you're expecting more people to use AI and you're training them or you're not training them, if there isn't a linkage to consequences around the assessment or the rewards or lack thereof around whether somebody's using it and effective, then you probably won't have a meaningful carrot or stick. And actually, just to quote it, 10% of respondents said we formally assess employees on their usage and proficiency with AI tools. Only 10% today.
And as we remember from the last slide, also only 15% of companies hire for it. It might not be a surprise if you've had some initiatives around putting in tooling just kind of flop. And then for anybody that's selling tooling around this, it's also really important, whether that's HR tooling or anything, it's also really important to remember that just because somebody bought something doesn't mean they're using it. So think about that as you are implementing and kind of drive engagement. So we talked about this a bit. If the most important thing to do, at least this right now, is to hire for these AI skills. However, there is a real tension with companies trying to figure out, well, how do I actually figure out what you're good at and what is an AI tool? This is most pronounced in virtual interviews. As you can see here, folks are really trying to figure out a way to assess for those core competencies. I saw some industry survey stuff from Survey Finder and then Gartner, which is said 75% of recruiters have run into fake AI resumes in the last 12 months. 30% of folks said that they had experienced like a deep fake or face swapping interview, which I thought was wildly high. And then Gartner thinks that 25% of all online profiles will be AI generated and not real by 2028. So, we've heard this anecdotally from our teams, particularly our remote teams, that, inbound is no longer really a useful channel for them because there's just so much fake garbage in it. And then even when they're doing outbound sourcing, there are just fake profiles. This is something that we're going to have to figure out eventually, but there is a tension between, yes, test for this, but also I want to know what you're good at. So how do I box this into encouraging AI usage in specific parts of the interviews that you're testing for that actually as a skill? And then, having other parts where you are assessing people's un-AI assisted skills around whatever their function is. Finding a balance between those two is going to be really important. And it's going to be different for every company based on what their interview flow is, how much of it is virtual and in person. And so we're seeing a default to, hey, there's at least one in-person deep dive skills interview for most roles. Take-home assignments are not that helpful anymore because you don't know who has done them.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see this too. I think anecdotally, I'm hearing trends of more in-person interviews happening, even for remote companies, because of the issue of fake profiles. But the one that I thought was really interesting in a trend was the fear that I think 6 or 12 months ago was really prevalent around AI being used in interviews, that people were kind of cheating if they were using AI, that sentiment is shifting quite rapidly, much more towards we need people who know how to use AI. And so rather than being fearful if they're using it to cheat, it's actually, we want you to use AI in these interviews so that we can see how much and how far you can use it to increase your productivity or be able to bring impact to the team. And so I'll be really curious in next year's survey just to see how much some of these numbers are shifting.
Yep, it's a great point. The 20% encouraging areas, I'm assuming that'll go up, but I think the pains are going to go up a lot too.
Be interesting too, in a year like how much inbound has really decreased, especially as teams are finding that it's a lot of muck in there. It was already muck 10 years ago to try to find the gems in it. And now with AI proliferating, it's exponentially harder to find where the valuable candidates are.
That's a great question. And I think next year, maybe that's a good topic we'll just go deeper into. Anecdotally, same stories around now that it's very easy to do automated AI candidate identification and outreach with customer outreach, both in sales and in recruiting. The email channel is starting to really suffer. I get thousands of AI-driven emails a day, so I don't even really look at my personal email box all that much. So if you're trying to reach out to me for anything, like 99% chance I'm going to miss it.
Yeah, I think we're all experiencing that right now.
Another thing we want to know is where's all this productivity going and what are you doing with it? Is it the tagline of, well, we're going to use this to cut as much of our workforce as possible? At least today, and at least in venture-backed companies, that answer is no. So your same size team can have much higher output than they did before. The only area that is not true is Series B, C, D startups. You can think of these as they're probably growing, but they may not be as growing as fast as they did before. It's a challenging fundraising environment, so they need to be really conscious about, headcount costs and just cash burn. And so those companies were the most likely to use productivity for headcount reductions. And when they did so, it was an average of 10% of the workforce, and it was largely around things like customer success. But surprisingly, engineering is a second one. So at least for today, and I anticipate this will continue, you're just going to have teams that are significantly more impactful and productive. You might shift some folks around to different initiatives, but there's a never-ending list within companies of things to do, and some of those are actually quite important, and even then you still can't get to them. So being able to tackle more, I think, where a lot of these gains go in venture-backed companies in particular, because the whole goal is swing for the fences. It's not, have better margins for the next quarter for your public earnings call. So it's a bit of a different game than some of the public companies.
This syncs up really strongly. I just saw a post on LinkedIn from Peter Walker from Carta. All his information is just so interesting. Yeah, so valuable. Just yesterday, the 13th of November, he posted that venture-backed firms raised 70% more capital in Q2 than back in early 2023, but they hired 23% less workers. So putting those two things together from the Lightspeed survey, we're not necessarily reducing staff yet. We're applying them to more things and do the things faster, but we're also not hiring at the pace that we might expect. Those two things seem to be working together. Like productivity, efficiency is really a thing now. We're no longer stacking talent like we had been in the past. And boy, the hiring volume in general seems to be tightening up. I don't know if that's something that you were able to gauge in any way, Luke.
Yes, and so I totally agree with that. We do see teams growing more efficiently. They're doing more with less. I don't think it's as extreme as some of the kind of Twitter chatter. You're going to have a one-person billion-dollar revenue company within the next couple of years. But the metric of success is how much am I hiring in any given year? That used to be the thing everybody bragged about. Like that is gone and probably gone forever. Now it's about how much you're doing, how many products you're building, how much revenue you're gaining per employee. So as a boards, we also look at, one of those questions is revenue per employee. And then you look at like what is best in class. And in later stage companies, it might historically have been 150 to 200 something K revenue per employee. You would expect to go up. I don't know yet if we've seen that. And of course, there's examples of companies that have hit ones, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars very quickly. But across the industry in aggregate, I think that's a number that is going to move up significantly in the future.
Yeah. It seems more like we're attriting down and just not backfilling than we are letting people go en masse, aside from a few big public announcements.
There's probably some impact on headcount, and we asked questions around that as well. The main finding here was that it is really tricky to be a junior career person right now. So we intentionally only asked, what are you forecasting in the next 2 years? We want to know more around how is this impacting your hiring plans next year or the one after? And so on average, about 28% of roles, technical and non-technical, are expected to be displaced. And I think that number is an undercount because, as we talked about before, a lot of this tooling is new. Folks are figuring out just how to use it. And, just using an extreme example of if you have an engineering team that can get as much value from a coding assistant without any of the people management, the hiring, the operational overhead, the cost overhead of a junior employee, like the natural thing they're going to do is that. The opposite side of that is, think about in your team, how do you grow the next generation of folks? Can't only have senior people. And not everything is purely senior work. The companies that are willing to hire really good senior people, I think Anthropic just mentioned this, they've had a lot of success tying together a very senior engineer with like an absolutely raw, fresh in career junior engineer who think about things different actually and use tooling differently because they've grown up with it. And they found that to be useful and also allows them to cherry pick the absolute best people since there is a demand shortage for junior and entry level hiring. But in general, we're coming up to kind of a painful time, I think, in transitioning workforces. And, I don't envy our friends that are just coming out of school in the next couple of years, trying to figure out how do they apply the skills and degrees they've been working on all this time to increasingly dwindling market of roles that are purpose built for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also leading to the implication that there's going to be a generation, or at least part of a generation of workers who aren't getting this entry level experience. And so how do you bridge that gap? And the Anthropic example is a really interesting one because you're going to have more and more companies saying, we want people who understand these AI tools. And so I'm curious, will this new grad early entry level be the answer to that in many ways, where they will be most open to the ideas of how to use and most creative of how to use these AI tools, and will come in, and this sort of partnership idea might be the unlock to some things?
I think so. We haven't dug deeply enough yet to really know which of our companies and, folks in our network have done this well of trying to scoop up some of the really talented junior folks. I think it's just too new.
Luke, one of the things that popped for me on this slide was the similarity in terms of technical versus non-technical roles that would be expected to be replaced by AI. Like, it seems like there's this head start on productivity in technical roles, but it seems like the gap there is lessening for the future. That, I don't know, I guess my interpretation is 29% technical versus 27% non-technical. That's the percentage of roles that are anticipated to be replaced by AI in 2 years. It seems like there's this strong belief that in other domains, AI is going to catch up and replace more elements of work in the very near future.
Yeah, it relates back to what's the productivity gains that teams are seeing. Technical and non-technical teams were much closer than I thought they would be.
Yeah.
Kind of touching a little bit on the performance side, this is something that's actually been really consistent over the last 2-3 years. So I would say 4 years ago, the main driver of attrition for all companies was mass layoffs. And everybody remembers this time of 10, 20, 30% layoffs happening once or multiple times a year. Now with these smaller teams growing more efficiently, the last 2 years in particular, the main driver of folks leaving companies has been non-regrettable attrition. So you're asked to leave. Even though attrition has stayed relatively steady across companies, it's always between 17, 18, 19% or so. The driver is performance managing folks out, bringing new people in that you think will kind of raise your average talent bar. So as an HR leader, just think through what is your ability to truly measure performance, future kind of aptitudes, and then can you build that into both employee development, but also a structured way to make sure that you're continually up-leveling your team.
Yeah, and I think the number standing out here is that 66% of non-regrettable attrition, that 2/3 of the attrition is happening kind of intentionally, of managing people out, typically followed by a PIP, or the next most popular route is like encouraging a voluntary resignation of like, this isn't a good fit. The other thing standing out to me is on the regrettable side, that the most common reasons, besides most of the time we think is like, oh, it's compensation, they're not getting paid enough, they're going to go somewhere else where they can get paid more. Well, connected to that is career advancement expectations. And I think in VC-backed companies, especially for early stage, it's hard sometimes to articulate clearly a specific ladder or next path or next job that people will have, because the business is also figuring out product market fit, or, what is even the shape or the size of this business next year. And so aligning that piece of what's the expectation for employees coming in, of how this experience plays into their longer term career arc. For me, this percentage of 67% of regrettable is leaving because of career advancement expectation misalignment is speaking to the need to reinforce that coming in the door of what do they hope to get out of this experience.
Or is that a recalibration that, hey, companies aren't growing as fast as they used to, and that means there aren't as many next level opportunities available? Our memories are sometimes long, sometimes short, where we expect to get promoted every 12 to 18 months if we're in a startup. And maybe that's just not the environment that we're in today.
So we've asked this question actually in every year's survey: what is attrition and what are the drivers? And it's essentially been this list in this order each of those years. But I think your point's correct. Companies are always terrible at this. The smaller you are, the worse you are at it. And then I think what could exacerbate it is, even if you want to be really good at this, skills development and advancement. I think when I hear people say career advancement, they mean promotion. But as teams say smaller, there's going to be less room to grow with your company, because you're not going to need another VP in a given department, or a director, or a head of, because your team's going to be smaller. So I don't anticipate this order changing very significantly. And then we've all kind of run into the insane one-off compensation decisions that are happening, particularly for research engineers. Really hard to find AI folks, where you're just thinking like, that is like a good chunk of our payroll. We can't possibly do that. So this list for the regrettable folks, which just means really good people you wish had stayed, is probably going to stick around.
Yeah, it's interesting how some of these topics just repeat again and again, of like, we're bad at it and we continue to be bad at it, partially because it hasn't made it to the top of the list of the most pressing thing. But I was just part of a discussion where startup leaders were talking about having a distinction between VP, SVP, and EVP levels at like 100-person startup. And I think that leads to like, there's a misalignment on expectation. Like at 100 people, like, why would we even need this level of distinction, the level of leadership complexity at that point in time from a management standpoint? Teams are so small. Like, it's crazy if your VP is asking for an SVP or an EVP title at that moment in time. I just feel like maybe you have the wrong VP sitting in that seat.
And then lastly, just something kind of tactical that we go over every year is what's happening with merit budgets. You're going to get asked, then you need to make decisions. They have not changed really ever. They're always between, when we've done these over the years, 3 to 5%. I think there's a larger percentage of folks that are doing 3% this year compared to other years. But even in the really high inflation days, I think most companies were saying we don't chase inflation as our comp strategy. And so budgets were relatively along there. I think the main shift that we saw this year is that 82% of companies are applying whatever their merit budget is evenly across teams, where in the past there had been more of a focus on technical teams. I take that to mean that it's true that non-regrettable attrition is the main driver. So we're letting go of the people that are not performing or want here. Then that means by default, everybody there generally is somebody that you want to retain. And so if you ignore any of them, it'd be like, well, engineering gets 10% and you get 0%, you're building in attrition risks. So, it's hard. You don't have a better budget, but everybody wants something. And no one in the world has ever been like, oh, a 3% merit increase boost makes me really happy this year.
I think when I was getting started in the people space and trying to figure out what do we do about raises, it was anecdotal. I had to go and say, hey, Andrew, what are you doing? And hey, Luke, what's going on here? And it was like piecemeal. And now we have more information out that's like, hey, it's kind of industry standard that you have a 3% budget. And so the fact that we're seeing it shift more and more towards this number, I wonder how much of that influence is some of these other trends and how much of it is people just start to know that that's a default.
I think it can be that. And really, the mantra for every company is efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Going to your board, your comp committee, and saying, hey, we want to do something that is anomalous to historical data and to what you're seeing in your portfolio, create X amount more burn, which is going to maybe, are we going to lose a month of runway from this or more? There's a lot of hesitancy because, everybody sees in the press endless announcements of XYZ AI company that's raised a ton of money. The reality out there for folks is, it is really challenging in a funding environment right now if you're not in one of these really hot niche deals companies that everybody's hearing about. There's plenty of teams out there that are really needing to figure out, how do I conserve cash, elongate runway, figure out what my act 2 or 3 is. What is our AI story? Actually grow that part of the business. Expenses, maybe even around compute and some of the AI features they're building could be higher than before. So there's just a big focus on line items of what are you spending and why.
Yeah. I mean, given that, I was looking at the fact that there's a category of who does not have a defined budget. It was interesting to see that there's 10% of startups.
That's the early teams. Most of those are actually don't even have a finance team. I think maybe 10% of the people that filled it out were the CEOs. That almost by default means you don't have a people person.
Got it. Okay. I guess for you, what was most surprising in these results, given that you've seen this year over year and you've seen some of these trends change and some of them not? The same numbers are coming back again and again. It was surprising to you.
How quickly AI tooling across everything has been adopted and then actually is like measurably making a difference. Like, assuming that number is ballpark right, being 30% more productive, like individually is huge. Junior folks are going to be in for a really hard next couple of years. Not surprising, but a little dispiriting. And hopefully we actually have a rational way to deal with this. And then also not forget that only senior people eventually will leave. And then if there's nobody else that can grow into a role and learn and get mentorship, you're missing out on a really important knowledge transfer. And that's not good for companies or the economy if we don't do it. And then, just the horror of virtual interviews in remote lands when we have increasingly AI interviewers talking to AI interview tools. So they're just going to be interviewing each other. Like, how do companies make decisions on figuring out if your skill set fit, a culture fits? And then what does that mean when you're actually here? Because of course, interviews are very condensed. They're artificial environments. It's always been difficult to tie that directly to, are you going to be good in this role? And will you like this role? Guaranteed to just get significantly more difficult.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how those pressures shift to more creative ways to figure that out, right? I've heard of a couple of rare companies who will bring an employee or a candidate on site for like a week trial and they'll pay them and they actually get to do the job. But that seems so far and few between right now. And I'd be curious.
We have a few that do that, and it's mandatory that you do a work trial, I think what they call it. And I believe the one I'm thinking of is, been very successful in, building the business and raising funding. Day one, it has been a limit on who can even do that, obviously. So you're limiting your candidate pool to an extent. They happen to be cool tech, interesting founders, interesting space. So they still have been able to do it. I would say for a lot of companies, it is going to be an insurmountable bar to get enough people for you to hire at any kind of scale to take multiple days off work just to interview. And then if we all decide we want to do that, if you want to talk 2 or 3 companies, you have to take like all your PTO for a month and just go work places. There's a tension there between, I agree with the idea, but actually getting it to work is tricky.
It's an interesting example of like, how can we take things out of the normal interview process of we have a few rounds, you talk to a few people, especially when we have the pressures on the current AI front where it's AI talking to AI at some point, right? And how effective is that? And what are other ways that we might see sprout up over the coming year or couple of years around that?
I'm thinking of a handful of suggestions or recommendations for our listeners, mid to senior level career HR professionals, mostly at these venture-backed tech companies. Would really love to, hear from both of you about like, there's this wonderful survey that's provided this excellent data. What should our mid and senior level HR, professionals go out and do? Here are a few things I wrote down. One is, if you're not already using AI in recruitment, now's the time. You're behind if you're not using it already in some way. Maybe related to that, assessing for AI and maybe even mandating some level of proficiency might be the future. It looks like there are much greater proficiency gains there. So productivity gains with proficiency, that seems to be an opportunity. Third is around the workforce size. And maybe there are 2 linked concepts there. I think we're seeing some job hugging where people aren't leaving on their own. They're only leaving if they're being asked to leave, the non-regrettable attrition. So get better at performance management now. And when you do have a departure, don't just assume that you should backfill. Like there may be a real efficiency, productivity opportunity when somebody departs. And none of those are like wonderful, like we feel great about those, but we can feel great about the efficiency that we're seeing. So like, let's help our companies, fully capture that.
Practice what you preach. And so if you, whoever's watching this, are not using some form of AI tooling, like I use Claude 100 times in a day for many different tasks. If you're not using it in your own workflows, then you're missing out on a really important career development piece. I actually haven't run into any good examples that I'm aware of that are good AI tooling trainings around Claude, OpenAI, and just really anything that's more function specific, so that if you just don't know, and you can play around and explore, but if there's a more structured way, if folks want to share what they found, that if it actually works, and then do the same thing for everybody on your teams too. Assuming the rest of the teams are going to figure this out, but HR, it's the workflow. We just need to follow it. It's going to set you back.
Yeah, I think on the AI tooling training front, Brandon Samet at Zapier and his team have been really great about sharing out how they're using it and making it very public. So I would encourage people to check him out. There's also an offshoot of Lenny's podcast run by Claire Vaux called How I AI. And it looks at a bunch of different engineers, designers, writers, and they go through their tooling and they screen share like exactly how they're using it. Across my executive clients' teams, many of them have some sort of shared learning component around AI right now, where in their team meetings, there is some version of, whether it's monthly, quarterly, weekly, happening where it's like, show something that you used AI for. And the other two things that came up for me that maybe I will double down on is when we talk about assessment for AI, there's a version of it as a candidate and how do we assess for their AI understanding. I was also thinking about it of, how do we make sure that there's some assessment for AI tools that we're using, and like what criteria do we use to consolidate a lot of this experimentation or usage is happening like in individual accounts or team level. And so as HR leaders, how do we think of partnering with IT on like what's the corporate level version of that? How do we test for security or sort of viewpoints on that? And so becoming more opinionated on AI tool assessments from that standpoint. The other thing that I was just reminded of when we were talking about some of the numbers that just seem repetitive year over year is the double downing of like, we all value our top performers. We want them to stick around. They're outsized impact for our organization. And the fact that career development, whatever shape or form, whether it's promotion, skills, realigning with the mission, but how do we make sure that we're paying attention to what that looks like from a top performer retention standpoint? It's just a great reminder for us to keep our eye on the ball. So easy to be thinking about who's attriting and getting lost in kind of the lower performers. They take up a lot of time, but also remembering to put our time on the top performers.
Those are all amazing points. And then actually, you reminded me that Zapier shared their framework for how they measure AI adoption and performance reviews.
We can include in the show notes. We're also having Brandon on in a couple of months, so we'll be really excited for him.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Lightspeed. Thank you for doing this work and sharing with the broader community. It's so valuable, and really appreciate you being an early guest and our first repeat on the People Leader Accelerator
Podcast. Look at that. Very cool.
Yeah.